Hello, Mr. Knight. Thank you for your time. First question about Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger's visit to China was met a very high level of reception and evaluation compared to other high-ranking U.S. officials, such as Blinken and Yellen. So, what does such a phenomenon indicate, and does the U.S. concern and value this phenomenon?
Well, I think Kissinger has a long history of being interested in China and in trying to improve U.S.-China relations, going all the way back to 1971. So in that sense, I think it's not surprising that he was received in Beijing at a very high level. And that indicates, I think, an interest in having some improvement in U.S.-China relations. So I think that it's basically good news. Well, I think that there has been some tension about the relationship and the question of who meets with whom that we've seen over the last year or so. And I suspect that there may be a signal which is being given by the Chinese government to the Americans by the decision to have Kissinger treated the way he was.
Many people believe it is not a very strong relationship between U.S. and its Western alliance now. How do you evaluate the current relationship between the U.S. and its Western allies? Is there a change in the soft power of U.S.?
Well, I think if one looks at soft power, it's the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. And that I think that the Pew polls, which is a very reputable foreign affairs polling company, shows that the U.S. is not doing badly in terms of its soft power. But could the U.S. do better? Yes, of course. Well, I think on economic aid and trade would be the area I would point to. Well, I think in all cases that you need to have successful economic relations. I think that there have been certain tensions that arise about the new legislation for what's called the Inflation Act, which is largely about climate, which gives certain preferences to American industries. And I think that creates tensions with Europe, also with Japan and Korea. And I think there are efforts being made to ease those tensions, but it does have some effect on American soft power.
During the Cold War, plenty of countries had to take a side, such as Soviet or US, but nowadays they want to maintain a very friendly relationship with both China and the US. So what's your perspective on this transformation?
Well, I think the idea of a Cold War is a misleading metaphor because there's much higher economic interdependence between the US and China than there was between the US and the Soviet Union during the real Cold War. And there's also much higher interdependence between US and US allies and China than there was during the real Cold War. Most countries welcome or wish to have successful economic relations with China and access to China's market, but they also do not want to be dominated by China. And that's why you find a lot of countries who want open access to China's markets, but also want an American alliance to prevent domination by China. So I think that's why you find ambivalence, that countries don't want to sign up for a Cold War type containment, which would cut off their economic access, but they do want the sense of defense that's provided by American alliances.
This match, Saudi Arabia and Iran restored relations in Beijing, while China also expressed its support for Middle Eastern nations to resolve the hotspot issues by communication and negotiation. So, how do you evaluate the respective roles of US and China in Middle East? And is there a competition for soft power?
Well, I think China's efforts to be a diplomatic influence in the Middle East does enhance China's soft power, and I think its efforts have been had some degree of success. On the other hand, if you go back to the Pew polls, which I mentioned earlier, which asked questions about which countries you find are more attractive, you'll find that in most of the regions that the U.S. Has more soft power than China. This is not true in Africa and the Middle East, where the two countries are more or less tied. But if they're tied in terms of trying to seek attraction through ways to improve diplomacy and peace, that may be a good thing for the regions.
For the soft power competition, except the Middle East, over the world, can you notice some other regions in the world?
Well, if you look at the international polling, which asks questions of, do you find a country attractive or not? There are more countries in Asia and in Latin America and in Europe and Australia which find the U.S. more attractive. On the other hand, in Africa, you find the polls show that the U.S. and China are equally attractive.
Okay. Last year, President Biden noted 3 key words in his China policy: invest, align, and compete. But in your previous interview, you shared your concern about Sino-US relations, highlighting the focus on competition over cooperation. So how do you evaluate President Biden's China policy?
Well, I think Biden has the aspirations that he said, which is to see this as a cooperative rivalry. But I think because of actions taken both in Beijing and in Washington, the emphasis has been on the rivalry and not on the cooperation. I think that there's been a realization that this is not balanced, and ever since Biden and Xi Jinping met in Bali last fall, I think there's been some realization that we need to think more of the cooperative aspect and improve our communications.
Okay, in 2019, you published a book named Do Morals Matter? And in this book, you created a presidential scoreboard to assess U.S. presidential foreign policy morality based on intentions, means, and consequences. So with Biden's first term coming to a close, what's your evaluation of his score?
Well, if you look at intentions, I think Biden's intentions rank well with previous presidents' comparison. I think he would like to see a peaceful and prosperous world, and that his intentions in that sense are good and get a good score. His means, I think, have been quite good. I think he sometimes made some mistakes, for example, in the way the withdrawal from Afghanistan was handled. I also think he has not had as open a international trade policy as I would have hoped. And so I think on means, he gets a good score, but not as high as intentions. And on questions of consequences, it's really too soon to know the full consequences. Biden is a little over halfway through his term as president. So far, I think he's done reasonably well on consequences, but it's too early to give him a score on consequences.
Some scholars believe the forthcoming elections about U.S. and Taiwan Islands would hugely impact Sino-U.S. relations. They thought that an international schedule should be addressed to manage some challengeable problems better. So, do you think this schedule is a necessity?
Well, I think it's important to realize that ever since the restoration of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and China 50 years ago, there's been a disagreement about the status of Taiwan. And when Nixon met with Mao, the two sides agreed to disagree. And that was basically formulated as a one China policy, which meant no independence for Taiwan, but no use of military force across the straits by Beijing. That compromise has preserved a stable status quo for nearly half a century. And I think that it would be wise for the U.S. and China to keep that compromise position of the one China policy and no use of force. I think there have been many statements and concerns. There have been American military officials who've talked about the dangers of 2027. I think these are artificial deadlines and numbers, and that it would be much wiser for both countries to keep the one China policy intact for a preservation of the status quo.
The U.S. has talked about the China Rising more than a decade ago. Now, after many years, have Americans already prepared for China Rising?
Yes, I think so. I mean, if I go back to the 1990s, when I served in the Clinton administration, I remember going to a summit meeting with Clinton and Jiang Zemin, and Jiang Zemin asked Clinton, do you want a weak China or a strong China? And Clinton replied to Jiang Zemin that we have more to fear from a weak China than a strong China. In evidence of that, the Clinton administration and the George W. Bush administration supported China's entry into the World Trade Organization and entry into American markets. So I think that indicates that the U.S. was responding to China's growing economic role in the world in a positive way.
You advocate for avoiding historical analogy, but what hand do you think the U.S. owns to prevent falling into the Thucydides trap?
Well, I think the Thucydides trap is a mistaken metaphor, and I think that it's greatly exaggerated. Even back in the days of the ancient Greek city-states, there's a question of whether Thucydides got the answer right. For example, Professor Donald Kagan, who was a great classic scholar at Yale, argues that the rise and the power of Athens had already ceased by the time the Peloponnesian War broke out. So there are questions that scholars have about the Thucydides trap. And when you try to apply it to modern conflicts between or rivals between nations, some people would argue that there really are very few or no examples of this type of power transition. So I've written a number of criticisms saying that we should be careful not to take the Thucydides trap too seriously or too literally.
But there are still some extreme anti-Chinese sentiments amid the elite class in the US, which leads to a huge pressure and uncertainty domestically whenever US officials meet with China. So how do you view this problem of political polarization?
Well, it's true that U.S.-China relations have gone through a severe downturn over the last 8 years or so. Many people argue in the U.S., in both parties, Democrats and Republicans, that China did not play fair, that it did not play by the rules. The U.S. opened the World Trade Organization to China, and then China used state-owned subsidies and theft of intellectual property to weaken the United States. And that led to a resentment in the United States. And so if you look at attitudes toward China, which were largely favorable in the beginning of this century, they've turned quite negative in the 20s. Now, partly that can be attributed to Donald Trump and his administration, but the attitudes had already become more critical of China before Trump administration. And many Americans think that that was because of China.
Okay, what's your opinion about the view that there must be a war between China and the US?
I think this belief that there's an inevitable war is a very dangerous belief, because when you believe that it's inevitable, that belief can be causal and can make it happen. I do not think that war between the US and China is inevitable, and I think it's essential for both sides to avoid it. If you think about whether China poses an existential threat to the United States, the answer is no. China does not have the capacity to invade the United States or to change the United States. Similarly, the United States is not an existential threat to China. China is too big for the United States to invade or change. So the only way in which the two countries could threaten each other's existence would be to blunder into a war, which could indeed be devastating for both. So I think we should be very careful not to let this view of inevitability of war to affect our policies.
You said before that the war between China and US is inevitable, but I think maybe in some issues we still have a competition. Why Biden signs the restriction on American investment to China's high-tech business in a low-key manner?
Well, there's a difference between decoupling in the overall relationship and what has been called selective decoupling or de-risking. Since the US and China do have a competition, including a military competition, it's natural for both sides to avoid something which enhances the military position of the other side. As the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has put it, we want to have a high fence around a small yard. In other words, we don't want to decouple the economies overall, but on areas which are directly related to national security and defense, we want to, in fact, have a selective decoupling. I think that's a natural and explainable position, and I think that's got broad support in the United States.
What's your picture prospect of Sino-US relations future, and what efforts should we make for such a prospect?
Well, I think if you look back over the whole period of U.S.-China relations since 1949, you'll see that it tends to go in about 20-year cycles. In the 1950s, we were actually at war with each other on the Korean Peninsula. In the 1970s, after Kissinger's visit, we were cooperating against the Soviet Union. In the 1990s to, let's say, 2010 or so, we had the period of engagement, of trying to improve economic and political relations. By about 2015 or so, this goes into a period of mistrust for the reasons that I've already mentioned. If that lasts 20 years, that would suggest that sometime around 2035, we might have a return or a turn of the cycle to better relations. But these things are not predictable. And the mistakes that we make in both sides can affect that future. I hope that what we'll see is in the 2030s, a return to a more cooperative future, because we have common interests relating to climate change or pandemics or proliferation of new technologies. These are all things which it's important for us to cooperate on, and I hope that over the next decade we'll learn that cooperation.